All right. Hi, everybody. Um, it's just past 7, so I think we'll get started here. I want to start off by introducing myself. My name's Caden Robbins. I'm an intern with the CSU Extensions office here in Gunnison. I've been conducting research on virtual fencing now for 2 summers. Last summer, I focused my research on the true costs associated with the technology. I went down to Pagosa Springs and visited Darla Bramwell. She's here tonight to speak with us as well. She taught me a little bit about how producers use the technology, and she's just, a bundle of experience and knowledge. So I was glad to meet with her, and she'll talk a little with you guys tonight about her experience using that for about 5 years now. And then I also want to thank John Ritten for being here tonight. He's an agricultural economist and the director of Rangeland. Um, John, help me out here. Give me your title real quick.
It's too long. My name's John. I'm an economist. Nice to meet y'all.
Yeah, thanks, John. John's also my mentor, one of my mentors for this internship. So he's here with me today to give me a hand and talk a little bit about the research he's conducted. And then Hannah Craner Kirsting's here tonight as well to just answer questions at the end if you guys have any. She's helped me a lot with this research project and kind of showed me the ropes with the virtual fencing as well. So anyway, let me finish off my research here. So I've been looking into the abstract external costs associated with virtual fencing, some of those being time, labor, and then resource acquisition. So doing more of a cost benefit analysis of the technology compared to the traditional hard fences. This summer, I've been working with government agencies to figure out what it is they think this technology is and how it can help them to achieve their goals on the rangelands. Whatever those might be. So I'll talk a little bit about that. Primarily, I'll look into that research I did last summer with the cost benefit analysis. And I'll start off here giving you guys an understanding of what virtual fencing is. So let me share my screen here real quick. Give me a second. It gives you all these things that pop up and you have to figure out how to do it. Okay, so um, I want to preface this first presentation by explaining that most of the technical stuff I'll be sharing with you tonight is based off a company called Vince. So a lot of it can be translated in between the different technologies. I would say there's a lot of technical stuff that can't, that's specific to Vince that I'll share with you, but the broad ideas of virtual fencing and how it can be implemented and the various techniques to use it and that kind of thing, I think that can be translated between those different technologies. And I'll share with you some of those technologies here in a little bit. So I want to start out by sharing with you the different components that are involved with the Vince virtual fencing. So the first is the collar that you put on the cattle. So this is responsible for tracking the cattle and figuring out their relation to the fence. So when they come in contact with that GPS will ping their collars and provide the stimulus and the sound that's associated with those collars. The next thing is the base station, which is a cellularly connected station that bridges the gap between those collars and the herd manager website. The herd manager website is where you as the producer will sit down and operate the Vince system. So here's a picture of a Vince on the right, and it's a digital image, but that red and the gray that you see there, those are the pressure zones. So the gray area is set by you as the producer, and that's the sound zone. So once they breach into that zone, they'll start receiving a sound stimulus. And then if they extend past that into the red zone, they'll receive the shock stimulus. The other feature with these vents is that once those cows leave the vents for whatever reason, if they decide to breach through that vent, they'll have a one-way gate allowing them to enter back into the pasture that they were fenced into without getting shocked. Now, I will say that there have been producers that have experienced their cows walking back into the fence and getting shocked. That's just an error with the GPS. It's designed so that they can come back in, and then the passive recapture feature of the fence will allow them to receive stimulus once again once they get back on that fence. There are three primary types of fences that you can put. These are the only three actually that you can apply to the cows' collars. in vents. And so those are the inclusion fences, and these keep the cows within a specific area. There's the exclusion fences, which are responsible for keeping cows out of an area like a riparian area, a poisonous patch, or maybe like a stack of hay or houses or something like that. And then the third is a movement fence. And I haven't myself had experience using this type of fence, but those that have been able to use it for strip grazing and that kind of thing. I don't know how successful that is, but the idea there is that as the cows move up the pasture, that fence will update and keep them from receding back down into the portions of the pasture that they've already grazed. So it doesn't necessarily forcefully move them. It's just an updating movement that keeps them moving along the pasture without forcing them to do so. So the collars themselves, they have a GPS receiver that's responsible for locating their position on the range, but also in relation to those fences. So that's what carries out that feature of the virtual fence. But it also allows you to track your cows while they're out on the range within range of the tower. They have an autonomous operation feature as well. And so the idea with this is that as the cows move on the range, if they, for whatever reason, get out of range of that tower, then the collars will continue to provide stimulus to those cows if they get up against a fence. These collars can have up to 16 different virtual fences downloaded to them with schedules. And so the schedule idea there is that you set a date that the fence will turn on, and then you set a date that the fence will turn off. That's so that you can have a pretty worked out schedule for when you're going to do movements. If you have that worked out, obviously that's pretty dependent on water and feed and that kind of thing. But the other idea there is that if a cow gets trapped in a pasture out of range of a tower, at a certain date, if that cow's run out of water and feed, that fence will turn off and she can exit. The next thing with these collars that's kind of specific to vents itself is the battery life. So this is highly dependent on the usage and the interactions that collar has with events. So according to vents, the battery can last anywhere from, if you move daily, it'll last 3 to 6 months. If you move weekly, it'll last 6 to 9 months. And if you're tracking the animals and that's all you're doing with the vent system, they'll last 24 months. So this is what Vince advertises. Hannah, my mentor, she had experience with these collars dying very quickly because her cows would get up against a fence and they'll beep and shock more frequently if they keep coming in contact with those fences, and that will decrease the battery life significantly. The other thing too is if your cows are if the collars are getting in contact with the tower more frequently because they've been out of range or something like that, I suspect that kills the battery pretty quick too. So I would say anywhere from, a few weeks. Recently we saw some batteries go dead on our program. So that's just something to keep in mind. So the base station itself, like I said, it's cellularly connected and bridges the gap between those collars and the internet. Some of the features of that base station is that the power is solar power, so it charges those batteries that are banked in the base station. And then the other thing is that they claim it can cover from 5,000 to 10,000 acres. This is all dependent on topography. I know Darla, she'll talk about it maybe a little bit, but she has quite a lot of towers, and a lot of that has to do, I think, with topography, and every area is different. So, if there's a lot of ridges and lumps on your range, you're going to have some issues with just one tower. So that's something to keep in mind. And according to Vince, those towers can last for more than 10 years without maintenance. I've talked with ranchers that had towers for 2 years and they had to go do something with the tower, whether that was because of weather or somebody running into it with an ATV or something, I don't know, but it's not necessarily a guarantee that it'll take 10 years before you have to maintain that tower again. So the Herd Manager website, this is where you as a producer is going to spend most of the time interacting with Vince technology. So this is where you're going to visualize your pastures from an aerial point of view, put down landmarks such as water, salt, gates, that kind of thing, so you can get an idea of how your range is working and how you can put down fences in relation to those different landmarks. So you build your fences on this website. You can track your cattle, where they've moved, how they moved and grazed. So there's grazing data along with all those features of when you're tracking them, so it'll keep a catalog of where they've been and how long they've been there. Another feature that you have within the Herd Manager website is the association of the ear tags to the collars. And this is a way you can track your cows. So if a battery dies, you know which cow's collar died. You can, if there's no movement from a collar for so long, you can know which cow has been down or if they lost a collar and that kind of thing. And then it provides you updates of those various things as well. So if your batteries die, it'll let you know if your batteries are dead. And if there hasn't been movement, it'll let you know, and those kinds of things. So you'll spend most of your time on the Herd Manager application. Here's a couple images that just depict that. You guys may have some things on the far right of your screen. If you just drag those around, you can look at these different images. You can see me up in the corner, I think, but there on the right, if you drag that thing over to the left, there on the right is a grazing map that shows you kind of what areas have been hit pretty hard by some cows. So you'll know kind of how they've been using that range and that kind of thing. And then on the left is just an idea of how people have used the Herd Manager to segment off different pastures in an allotment. So here, I'm going to talk a little bit about two of the main experiences that might make or break your time using virtual fencing technology. These are where I get the most complaints having talked with producers. So the first is collaring. So you want to first start off by cataloging that collar. So there on that bottom left picture, you see B62A, and that's the MAC address for that collar. Once you put that on a cow, you match that MAC address to the ear tag of the cow you put it on. And that just allows you to know which cows are with which collars within the Herd Manager website. The other thing is that when you want a collar, ideally you want to bring them through the chutes at the same time that you'd already have those cows going through a chute for vaccinating, and then maybe when you're pulling collars, when you're preg checking and that kind of thing. So, because it does add time and labor, and I'll talk a little bit about that, but primarily you can really decrease that amount of time it takes if you have them already coming through the squeeze chute. And then how you put the collars on, really, it's different for each cow. And here in the bottom left, you can see how we're sizing those collars. To this collar specifically is being sized for a 40-inch circumference neck. And so you want to keep in mind, if you've got a young heifer you're collaring, you want to keep it looser so that as she grows out on the range, it won't squeeze her neck too tight. And then also, when it gets hot, those necks are going to expand, so you don't want to have them right up against the neck. A tip that was given to me by Hannah, my mentor, when I was going out to collar this year, is that you want the collar to come over one ear on the cow and not the second ear. So you can kind of pull it over one, and then if you can't get it over the other, that indicates that it won't be able to come off. We didn't have any issues last year, but I've talked with a lot of ranchers that had collars come off pretty frequently. The next thing is the training. So this is where I've seen a lot of struggle. So when you're training cows, it's about a 3 to 5 day process, and you're training them on a physical fence with the virtual fence on there as well. So the first day you have it directly on the boundaries of that physical fence. So when those cows get to that physical fence and get shocked, they can associate the shock with something physical and not just some arbitrary thing shocking them. The second day, you move that fence a little further away from the physical boundary to kind of give them it's still associating them to that physical fence, but it's no longer directly on that physical fence either. So it kind of gives them the idea that it's not always going to be something in front of them to shock them. And then the third day, you either move it in closer. It's very dependent on the pasture and the amount of feed. So however long you're going to be on there. But within the 3 to 5 day range, you want to cut the pasture in half so that they can come in contact with a virtual fence that doesn't have that physical barrier as well, so that they can associate the shock and move away from it without having to associate it with something physical. So sticking with a path, I talked with one of the Vince rancher assistant people there at the company, and they helped me with the specific pasture I had and that we were training on. And he helped me build a program specifically for that pasture. As long as you stick to it, I think the cows will learn it decent. And it definitely helps if the cows have used the system before. So if it's your second year, that first year might be pretty tough. So just keep that in mind. I want to talk a little bit about what we've been doing here in Gunnison County. So the ranchers that I've worked with, or the rancher I've worked with these last 2 summers, has been taking advantage of the extension program that allows trials of the towers. And I think this is a wonderful program because it lets people try it out without having to put up that first $10,000 tower fee. So there's 2 towers now, and where both of those are on the same range at the moment, working with the same rancher. And this is his last summer. So if you are from the Gunnison Valley next summer, there is an opening with that program. And I believe it's first come, first serve. So as long as the system will work with your range and what you want to do. So we've been doing that, and we put the towers on the trailers and move them throughout the range wherever they might be most helpful in reaching those cows, because we only have those 2 for a lot more acreage. And I'll tell you right now, we've had to move them already 3 times, I think. Well, I've had to move them twice on not a very large permit with quite a big amount of openings. So that just puts into perspective how much acreage they actually can cover. So I want to talk a little bit about the research I conducted. So I want to start off with the increases in time and labor associated with implementing this technology. So the first is collaring cattle. And that would primarily be getting those collars ready. It takes a little bit of time of cataloging them. And then the actual collaring process, I would say, is pretty quick, as long as if you're the only one in there doing it, it might take a lot longer. But if you're running those cows through the chute to do something else, like vaccinating, it shouldn't be there shouldn't be much more time associated with doing that. The next thing is the fact that it requires pre-planned management, which I think might be more of a benefit, but it is definitely something. The ranchers that quit using it, that I talked to, that had used it for some time and quit, most of them had a really bad experience of trying to move cows with the virtual fence already being downloaded to those collars and active at the moment they tried to move the herd. And so if you can pre-plan your movements and turn the collars off beforehand, you can really save yourself a lot of heartache, but it does require that pre-planned management. Another thing is that the Vince company itself is constantly updating their website. And they had a big update between the time that I did research last summer and then the time that I did research this summer. So I had to completely relearn it, and it was a lot of time it took to really get to understand it. And I don't even know most of the features still. I probably know, I would say 60% of what that application is capable of. And then some of the downfalls, the first is that hard fences are still necessary. If you're planning on using this technology to completely eliminate your hard fences, you're not going to succeed. Most cows, there'll be something to entice them out of that exterior boundary for sure. I have talked with a lot of producers who feel that the interior fences can be eliminated, but many of them still keep them up to date because it's a requirement of their as being a permittee on certain allotments. So you can get rid of those, but not at the moment with certain requirements. But then also the technology isn't quite where you can completely use it as the fences. And then the other thing with Vince itself is that it does require a yearly battery replacement. Every rancher I've talked to so far pretty much replaces batteries every year. So that 24-month deal that Vince advertises, I don't think is necessarily accurate, but it is something to keep in mind because maybe you could reach that amount of time. And then the big thing with Vince as well is that it doesn't have a mobile application. So you have to be on a computer, which is kind of inconvenient at times when you need to turn something off on the range or whatever it might be, because it does take a long time to update. And if you're out of range of a computer and it's going to take you hours or so to get back to a computer, you've lost a lot of time to do that. And then the final thing, as far as heartache with this technology, is the fact that it's very expensive, and I think it requires a lot of outside help. If you're trying to use it for a long period of time, I've talked with ranchers that are able to fund it for a short period of time to achieve temporary goals that aren't long-term. I think the technology can be here and work for long-term goals. so long as it's available to people. And there's grants that are available to help with this technology. And then different programs like the extension's offering to kind of trial it and figure out if you do save enough money to implement it long term. Because there are ranchers that have had a lot of success to where that money isn't really, it doesn't compare to the achievements of using the technology. So just keep that in mind. So I want to talk a little bit about what I find to be pretty, more on the bright side of using this technology. I think there's a more in-depth analysis of how cattle graze, so you can really figure out how they're using your allotment and react to that in a better manner that next year or years to come. It allows for a more increased precision grazing. So this might be, splitting each pasture up into a lot more segments. So you have, on an allotment, let's say you have 6 pastures at the moment with hard fences, you could quadruple that almost if depending on the herd size and available forage and water. But because of those different hard fence allotments or pastures, you're really restricted there. With virtual fencing, it really opens that up. I've talked with ranchers where they were able to decrease poison death by quite a bit if they weren't able to get in and treat a certain portion of poison. And one rancher specifically had a heartache with the same patch coming back year after year, and had quite a few cows die from it. So they were able to succeed in excluding that from their pastures. Another thing that maybe is the most obvious right off the start is the decrease in gathering time at the end of the year. So the rancher I'm working with this year, I think this is the main reason that he came back to using the technology. He gathered this last year, I think, in 2 days, and usually, as many of you guys know, it takes many weeks. So he was able to save a lot of time there. And then it also increases and encourages stewardship. So the idea there is that I talked with a rangeland manager this morning, and it's less that it completely gets rid of certain tasks. It just increases your understanding of how to complete those tasks. And, it makes you more understand your allotments and your pastures, because you have to know how to vince the cows into those pastures to be able to successfully use virtual fencing. So if you put a fence in the middle of a draw, let's say, and those cows are going to go down that draw for water or just naturally follow the topography, likely they will make their way through that fence in a lot of cases, especially if they're new to the technology, because they naturally want to go down it. And fence is a psychological barrier, not a physical one. A rancher told me that last summer, and I just think it speaks a lot about what the technology is. So, you got to think more about how the cows are going to respond, because you can't force them really to do anything with this technology. You have to be more technical about it and think more about what the cows are going to do when you put a fence down. So I think it definitely increases people's understanding of their cows and their land when they do that. So I want to talk a little bit just for a second about the different companies that are available. So Vince is the one we just talked about. The costs for this company are $10,000 for the base station, which cover about 5,000 to 10,000 acres. As we talked about, that's not necessarily set in stone, and it's all dependent on your specific situation. There's about a $50 per year fee between the collars and the batteries. And then the other is halter. So this is a big one on the scene right now. I think it's one of the biggest, if not the biggest, globally. So it requires a $7 monthly fee for each collar that you're using. And then it also requires the $4,500 base station fee as well. Some of the features that differ from this to Vince is the fact that the collars are solarly charged, so you don't have to replace the batteries. They provide biometrics of the cows, so temperature, if they're coming into heat, that kind of thing. So that's pretty interesting to be able to look into. There's no, I haven't had experience with this, so I can't speak on it for sure, but it's definitely something to look into. The other thing is that it provides a more refined grazing experience. And this again is just from what people have said. So it's not necessarily something we've tested or that I've experienced personally, but supposedly you can rotationally graze and strip graze in a more efficient manner than with Vince, because the GPS is more accurate. But I can't speak to that because I've never used it. The other company is Gallagher. So it requires a $250 fee per collar because you own the collars, and they also give you a 3-year warranty. So the idea with this company is more of a long-term system where you buy the collars once and then use them on multiple cows throughout your time using the company. And then there's also the $2 a month charge per collar. Some of these features are that it can run off a cellular service rather than just the base station. But if you are out of range, you can have a base station set up to reach those collars as well. And then the last thing here is I want to talk a little bit about the GPS ear tags and just go over it, because if you're trying to just locate cattle, vincing is not for you. There's so many other features associated with it and costs because of that. That if you're just trying to locate cattle out on the range, then I think this is a good option. And the costs here range anywhere from $15 to $200 per tag. The lower end there, in conducting my research online, the $15 fee is because the range is only about 50 meters and is Bluetooth, so it's not cellular or satellite. And the upper end is with cellular and satellite detection of where those cows are. And most of these companies require a subscription fee as well. And then some of those features associated with the AirTags are the fact that they are reusable in a lot of cases, and they do charge on solar. And then two of the companies that I looked into were Movement and Embedded Works. So that's kind of just, if you are looking to just track your cows, that's another thing to look into. And those other three companies I talked about are options. I think Vince, I've only worked with it, so I'm pretty biased, but it seems like a more popular option here in Colorado specifically. And I think Darla is a better person to talk to about that. And if you would share a little bit about your experience, Darla, I'll quit sharing my screen here, and you can jump on for me.
Well, thank you very much to everybody. And my name is Darla Bramwell. I live in Chromo, Colorado. We run between 300 and 350 mama cows, and then we have a yearling operation also. I run on a forest permit. I also run on private and leases, a lot of leases. I'm a 5-year user of Vince, so I started out when they were using zip ties to hold the collars on. So it's definitely been a big improvement over the last 5 years with the collars themselves. I guess I got into this because the ranches that border where we have our cattle have all been bought up as subdivisions. So if we wanted to run the cattle on the permits and on our private stuff, we were going to have to do something, because I'm sure, as the rest of you know, people won't shut a gate, or some people completely tear the fences out. So in order to keep our operation going, we had to find something that was going to work. I looked into Vince because they run on satellite and GPS. I start at 7,800 foot, and my permit goes up to 10,000 foot. So my terrain is hilly in a lot of the places and then flat in others. I don't have good cell service in a lot of places, so I kind of rely on the satellite to keep my fences up, even though my cows are not in GPS range. So I guess another thing I just want to talk about, Vince is a great tool to have in your toolbox, but it's not the only tool. You still got to keep up your exterior fences the best you can. The movement, it works great on smaller herds. The movement doesn't work as good for me on a larger number of herds. Now my cattle all respect the Vince because we trained them, in our hay fields when we first started this. And so I've had 5 generation, or 5 years worth of cows. So now pretty much nothing has to get shocked. It's all pretty well run on the beat. I know Caden talked about pre-planning, and that's really important. And it was hard for me to get over to explain to my crew that, just because they were low on water that day and they wanted to move them out, we couldn't do it. You have to pre-plan stuff, and that was kind of hard for them to figure that out. It has a lot of great virtues as far as excluding when I'm grazing other people's property. they want me to exclude their houses and their garages and stuff so that the cattle can't go over there. And I can do that. You cannot exclude the calves. And I've never been successful about putting one of these collars on a bull. Those ear tags really interest me. I'd like to look into that. But otherwise, we've had great success. There's a lot of pastures that have no fences in them. Some of the owners have just went in there, tore the fences completely out. So we have been using these collars this year to keep them in pastures where there is no fence. So I think it falls to the fact that my cows are trained really well with these collars after so many years. The staff at Vince, you can't ask for better people to help you. I can call my guy late at night. I can call him in the morning if I'm having trouble. As with all technology, it's kind of like our cell phones. Maybe some of you aren't quite as old as me, but we started out with the bag phone. Now look, it's in our hip pocket. So technology gets better every year. We make changes every year. I'm not trying to sell you on the Vince product. I've never tried any of the rest of them. I just know that I wanted something that worked with the satellite and GPS. But as far as some of the things he touched on, I would say when you're collaring, to be pretty careful because it can get kind of dangerous the first time. I mean, them cows, as you all know, sling them heads around in those chutes, and it gets kind of wild there for a while. I did invest in a chute that has a neck extender, which has made a whole new ball game for us because us girls do it, and no one's getting hurt or getting their fingers smashed or anything. So that works out well. If you've got any questions for me, I'll try to answer them for y'all. Otherwise, ask away.
Hey, Darla, could you talk a little bit about the amount of towers you have and, why you chose to keep buying some or why you
Sure.
chose to improve on that?
Sure, I have 5 towers. I started out with 2. Now I have several herds of cattle in different areas, so I needed towers where I had the herd, and one tower may not reach over there for that. And I've actually had a neighbor buy a tower to fence me out because they did not want to put up a fence. So they actually bought a tower, and it was great for me. Works for them. It keeps my cows off of them since they didn't want to put up a fence, and I didn't have great service over there. The towers, were really expensive for me to get into. The whole operation was very expensive to get into. I was kind of a beginner, so I didn't get into some of the programs that they have nowadays. But there are some programs out there for the people that are just getting into it now through the NRCA.
Hey, did we
Different
lose Darla?
organizations that can word on them. Sorry, did my unstable network, it says.
Oh, I don't know. Yeah, I could have lost you or you could have lost us. I'm not sure, but you look good now. So
But yeah, that the Forest Service, they didn't really back me when I started it. I was the guinea pig. Now I've talked to the other permittees, so it's come a long ways.
So when you trained your cows, did the gentleman at Vince, did he help you with your specific allotment, or did you follow the same training protocol that they advertise?
I had zero help when I went into this 5 years ago. I did my research on the computer. I bought everything on the computer. When it came in boxes, and it looked like from IKEA because there are 10,000 parts, and I had no idea how to put it up. So I was frustrated. I checked online to try to see someone that could help me, someone else. I'm in an area where I'm the only one doing this. So I had to go out of town in quite a ways. I found a BLM worker in the Valley of Alamosa, and she actually came over and helped me build these towers. She just stayed the weekend. I just took her fishing. So I had no help. She was the only help that came in. After I got into Vince and got in the herd manager, then they of course assign you a guy to help you. And like I said, my guy's great. I can call him at any time. I'm sure I'll drive him crazy, but a lot of they, like you said, they changed things this year, and I'm not a real technical person, so I had to relearn everything. But it once I figure it out, it's fairly easy. But changes is hard. It's kind of like telling the guys to let me know when they're going to move something or whatever. But if when it all works, it works great.
If there's anything else you'd like to share as far as your experience, go ahead. I will say Darla she was a huge help last summer with my internship. She took me out on the range, and she was the only rancher that really took me to see all the cows in the allotments. So I really got a good understanding of how it actually works in the field, because there's advertisement and stuff that doesn't really pan out in the real world. So anything else, Darla?
No, just find you someone that's done it and before you start, and let them help you out, because we, as a normal rancher, we have a different language than some of them high tech guys that work for events. So we talk a different lingo. So it helps to talk to someone that knows what you're doing, and that understands what you're wanting to do. But so that would be the biggest thing, is find a mentor to help you, and just be open minded about the stuff first, and be ready for a little frustration if this is your first year and your first the herd's first time with callers, because it takes a while to get the cows to figure this out.
Yeah, I talked with quite a few ranchers last year, and those that were getting funding, or in some circumstances, they were being encouraged to use the technology, to be paid to use it. And I think that's a good system too, to get people past that first year, because a lot of ranchers, they try it the first year, and it's such an awful experience because it's so different than the regular way of managing cows. However, if you can adopt it, I think it's something that, it is a very different management system, but it's something that really improves your management. So if you can get past that first year, I think that's the biggest hurdle for both you and the cows, of course. But especially if they keep updating the system and how to use the vent system. So
And we're supposed to get a deal at work, a phone app for it. So that'll help. But yeah, don't be discouraged, because it does have a lot of things. You, like you said, on gathering in the fall, it took us 3 weeks. Now it takes us about 3 days, and we have a large permit. But and you can vents out some of those like larkspur patches, and I do a lot of river restoration, so I can vents that out so they don't get involved in the restoration projects and wetlands. And then it may even open up pastures for you if you can tell the people with private land, hey, I can put a little vents around your house so those cows won't be right there in your yard, and then you can still go ahead and graze the rest of their property so they can get their ag status. So there's some benefits to it too, versus just the bordering of the fences.
yeah, of course. I want to say one last thing, just before John hops on here, is the fact that, and Darla, you might see this too, is if as more producers start to use the technology, I do think that those tower costs will decrease, because if you have neighbors that are trying to use the technology as well, you can split that cost. And then if you have 3 or 4 neighbors, you can split that cost 4 ways. And then also, I've been talking with government agencies, many of which are interested in using this as a tool. So I think there's a bright future as far as the costs are concerned. I think as agencies want to adopt the technology, they might have government funding to put up different towers. And then, the collar and battery fees are up to the producer, but you might see gain as a result of accessing more forage. You might see more gain in your cows to offset that cost entirely. So it's hard to say. And then I just think in the near future we might have more resources available for those towers. And working together with your fellow ranchers in your community is a big one. So, John, if you want to jump on and talk a little bit about your experience with it.
Yeah, absolutely. Let me pull up my slides real quick. Kate, is that showing the full screen or has I got the notes on it?
There are no notes there well, it says click to add notes, but,
How about that?
there you go. That's
Sweet,
perfect.
awesome. Yeah, we use Teams most of the time, so I'm still learning Zoom a little bit.
Yeah, same,
Um,
same.
So, good evening, everyone. So I know, Virtual Fence is a relatively new technology, but I say that a little bit tongue in cheek because I first worked with Virtual Fence in 2003 down at New Mexico State University as a graduate student. So it's been around a while. And so kind of how it's taken off in the last few years has been kind of interesting. I also think it's been a little bit maybe longer coming than I expected 20 years ago, but um so I've been thinking about this a lot. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the things we've done, maybe some of the things we've learned, some of the things that have changed in the last 20 years, and then at the very end, we've actually got some kind of cost calculations online that you can compare those different companies that Caden was talking about. Um, and so to Darla's point too, right? Once your cows are trained, they're pretty well trained. And when this was originally kind of thought up a long time ago, they actually had solar panels on the collars themselves and had ear tags correlated with them. It was a lot different than the system we have today. But the idea then was that you only had to outfit 10% of your herd was the thinking. And it's so if you can identify the dominant 10%, that's probably all you need to do. You're still going to have some calves walking around, right? But that was the thinking 25 years ago now. So I think some of these costs, again, to Caden's point, may come down in the future. But this again, in the last 5 years, really probably is Vents has really taken off. They were kind of the first one to get to market in the United States. And from an economics perspective, I think Caden kind of nailed it at the end there, right? Is forage efficiency is a way that, we talk about the cost of Vents, but what is the benefit? And so can I get my cows to an area that's got higher quality forage, whether that's protein or just quantity out there in the landscape through that kind of herding mechanism? And again, 25 years ago, we were trying to work with MIT to get it to automatically link with remote sensing, both for actual precipitation amount, soil moisture, and then forage quantity. We're getting closer to that still. I've been doing some work with ARS, really trying to map out standing crude protein on the ground, and then can we actually have that automatically update the virtual pastures? We're not there yet, but we're getting there. Another big one is prevent overgrazing, right? So this is on both my personal ground as well as any sort of public land management, right? Or my neighbors, as I can say, I'm only going to be there a certain amount of time, or there's certain areas that always get beat up, and I'm going to rest that area this year or this month, whatever it may be. And so there's some benefits there. Again, I think all of us in the West, so I've been working in the Western United States now for 25 years, right? Riparian areas are always going to be a concern, specifically on any sort of federal permit. And so if we can actually show that we have these, right, pasture boundaries set outside of those riparian areas and then couple that with GPS location data, I think that only helps benefit our case for continued public land grazing. Um, One that's getting interest here in Colorado, but also a lot of BLM agencies in Idaho specifically are looking at using cows to create fire breaks, right? And so again, can we get to that strip grazing? Can we get those fine fields, specifically cheatgrass and ventonata medusa head down low enough that we're not going to have these 200,000 acre fires going across, southern Idaho and western slope of Colorado out in Nevada? As well as manage invasive species. So it's not just fire breaks, but cheatgrass, right? It's actually a decent forage if you get to it at the right time. And so if we can look at some sort of remote sensing and say, I know I've got cheatgrass in this pasture, I want to keep them. Even if I don't believe in, any sort of mob grazing or management intensive grazing, I just want to dump everything into this area right now and graze as much as I can to start to deplete that seed bank. I think there's a economic benefit there. It'll take us some time to learn how to do that effectively, I think. To Darla's point, right? It's constantly learning, but I think that's one option as well. And then we're starting to explore, starting a project this year with CCA, looking at, basically using livestock as ecosystem engineers. Can we create wildlife habitat at landscape scale using cows? So we don't want homogeneity across our landscape. We need tall structure in places. We need short structure in other places. And can we actually make that happen using this technology? And before I go too much farther, just to show you that it was interesting to me looking at the data over the last 15 years, we've actually seen a decrease in operations that use any sort of rotational or mid grazing. I actually expected the number to be going up, given how often it's in popular press and all the magazines that we read. There's actually less people over time that are using it. And it's pretty much across the board, other than a couple counties in Colorado seem to be pretty fixed in the number of operations using this. So again, I think Vents is and the other virtual fence platforms maybe are coming in, a few years too late after maybe the peak of rotational grazing. But it is something that I think we can use for a lot of different outcomes. So one thing we did here at AgNext, I'm part of a new multi-college group, really looked at, again, sustainable solutions for animal agriculture. So again, we're in a few different colleges, lots of different departments, really looking at big picture questions. And one question we had was, can we use virtual fence to improve efficiency? And we frame that in the way of steer performance. So this is a yearling trial, not cows, which again has the challenges of collar sizing, right? So there are groups across the country right now, primarily at land grant universities, but some other tech firms too, that are really looking at ways that we can build new collars that grow with animals that don't come off, but don't strangle animals and don't have any of the challenges that Caden talked about earlier. And so those are coming, right? The technology is improving. Those are coming right now. But we did have those challenges of working with steers and really looking at improved efficiency. And really what we wanted to look at was warm season and cool season grasses, right? So I'm part of a 14th year now, long-term study up in Northeast Colorado outside of Nunn on the Pawnee National Grasslands. We have pastures that are either dominated by warm season grasses with some cool season grasses on either side, or a lot of cool season grasses, some warm season grasses. And, those are actually decent pastures for these yearlings because they can kind of mix and match what they need depending on the time of the season. But we want to know, can we actually consolidate animals, right, to take advantage of that protein specifically at its peak, right? So either kind of in that really hot summer for our warm season grasses, or that early season green up and that fall season green up, and can we move those animals around across larger pastures to get them where they need to be? And one thing that we were measuring as a side of this, because again, we have a lot of industry partners at AgNext that have made some sort of net zero commitment for 2030, 2050. And so methane emissions is something that, a lot of the packers and a lot of the retail partners in this space care about. So we measured enteric methane emissions. Now, a lot of ranchers probably don't care as much about that until I tell you that really methane emissions is just lost energy, right? It's energy that came into the animal that didn't get turned into protein, right? So it leaves through the mouth of that animal. So that's one way that we can measure efficiency, is how many emissions come out the front end rather than get converted into edible protein source. And so again, this is just a real kind of simple crude diagram, but we had pastures that were pretty much identical in terms of forage composition. And what we did is we had virtual fence. In this case, we used vents on both sets of animals and just didn't turn the virtual fence part on for half of them. We just left them in one pasture. We had the virtual fence just doing GPS location for us. And on the other side, we used it and we did, kind of that timed grazing. And so this is where we think the cool season grasses are going to be at their peak. We're going to put them there early. We're going to go to that warm season in the middle of the summer and put them back down on some cool season later on, potentially. And so we're still going through a lot of this data. I'll tell you the performance data right now. We're actually going through the animal behavior stuff right now, which I think should be done in the next month or two, probably. So I might have some more updates there. But animal behavior is really interesting when it comes to this technology. So figure out where animals are grazing when they weren't, why, how far they walked. Really cool stuff, just from a science standpoint. But before I go too far, do you want to say that this was last year? And last year, Northeast Colorado was a drought, right? We had less than 3/4 of our annual growing season precipitation. So we were forage quantity limited, which likely impacted our results. So I'll have some more data after this year. We're doing a similar study. But in the pasture, that was about 2/3 warm season grasses with some cool seasons. By using virtual fence and keeping them on those grasses as they greened up, we actually decreased animal performance, which is not what we expected. And we increased enteric methane. So basically, we were less efficient and our animals did less well on those grasses. Cool season, again, they didn't gain as much, but we actually decreased enteric methane a lot. And the reason that happens is enteric methane production increases as forage quality declines, right? And so if we can keep them on those active growing plants, we actually decrease enteric methane. So we did a pretty good job of targeting where to put them, but they just didn't gain enough because we just couldn't get their guts filled, what we think. And so there is some benefit, and you'll probably start to see similar to carbon markets right now, right? For carbon sequestration on rangelands in the future, you're likely going to see some insect opportunities to reduce enteric methane, because 75% of the enteric methane produced from the beef industry comes from grazing animals, primarily cows. So you might have some market opportunities. And we actually think, even though our study wasn't great, that if we have ample forage reserves on the range, we can actually use virtual fence to decrease enteric methane emissions. So that might be a funding source to get some of those base stations paid for. That could be one of those contract stipulations. Probably still a few years down the road till we get this verified and into the scientific literature, but that is one option for funding likely in the future. Unfortunately, we also showed that virtual fence reduces performance if in years of drought. It's not a silver bullet. I've worked in drought for 20 years, right? And always looking for a way to get through drought and virtual fence. If there's just not much grass out there, you're probably better let them go find it themselves, right? Don't try to tell them where to go. Let them range far and wide to get as much grass as they can. At least keep that rumen full. When we talk about training, we had a bunch of different cattle in this study, and the local kind of winter graze with a little bit of backgrounding steers did a lot better with virtual fence technology. And that means two things. One is they performed better. They actually didn't see as severe of a drop off in animal performance. And two, they respected the boundaries. It didn't take them as long to get trained to that virtual fence compared to animals that came out from Nebraska, for example, where there's, stand up belly high in grass. They come out here and see some of our short grass and they don't even know what to do. So they're just running around, blowing through fences. And so sourcing cattle can become a little bit important if you're thinking about this technology. And then I think Darla talked about this a little bit. Caden talked about this. Like, just use that GPS information when you help design virtual boundaries. So this is a very similar graph to what Caden showed. This is, again, one of those larger pastures. And in 2002, you can see that the animals really kind of congregating in 3 of those 4 corners, really along that western fence line. And we started to see some bare ground. So this is, again, a longer term study. And we just had GPS collars on there to see where they were. And so we said, you know what, let's take those corners out. And there's a little riparian area down kind of in that lower left corner that we use. So this is primarily exclusion areas, right? Let's keep them out of those sensitive areas. And sure enough, it worked, right? We actually kept them out of those areas and we start to see some recovery. So we can use this for a rangeland management improvement. Again, through that exclusion feature of keeping them out of areas where we don't necessarily want them. Now it's going to be interesting to see this year. Again, we just started this. I think the colors went out 2 weeks ago, so I don't have any data to show, unfortunately, yet. But looking at creating habitat for the lesser prairie chicken in eastern Colorado. And so again, really looking at the different critical life stages of the bird and make sure we have all of those needs met within their native range. So again, we're not looking for homogeneity across the landscape. Now we're looking for areas that we exclude cattle from, other areas that maybe we graze down harder than we would have otherwise. But again, looking for options that we can then monetize some of this habitat creation using virtual fence without having to run a bunch of either permanent fencing or even electric fence and all the labor to move that every few days. So here's probably the more important part of what you guys want to look at. And I apologize in advance for these graphs. This was a co-author of mine, did these. They're all in metric because they went to an academic journal. But basically, this is comparing financial outcomes or the costs, really, ignoring some of those other costs that Caden talked about earlier, but really the cost of physical fence versus virtual fence for management. And it really depends on, the first one is total acreage. So the bigger the operation you're trying to manage, and specifically if you're trying to rotationally graze, virtual fence gains an advantage. If you've got 40 acres out back, it's really hard to justify a $10,000 base station, right? Another one is the cost of traditional fencing. And so I've worked in New Mexico, Colorado, Wyoming for 25 plus years. I actually work a lot farther west with colleagues as well. And the cost of our fencing compared to, say, my family back in Minnesota, it's like night and day, right? And so up in mountainous terrain where we're putting fence across rocks, all those things, the more that traditional physical fencing costs, it becomes an advantage to use virtual fence to not have to put in that actual physical fencing. And the number of pastures you want to do. So if you're just subdividing one pasture into 2, a north and a south or east, west, whatever it may be, not as big as an advantage. But if you want to do like 30 different paddocks and you're going to rotate them through every 3 days, then virtual fence becomes more economically feasible. And this is the one that's really was confusing to me. I still don't like the way they did this, but that bottom graph is stocking rate. And the way they report it is area of land per head. So it's like the reverse of the way I think of stocking rate. And so the bigger the number means the less number of animals we have for a specific ranch size. So the more animals you have, it actually favors physical fencing over virtual fence because most of the cost is actually tied up in those collars. We see the sticker tag of a base station and it makes us gasp a little bit. But if you start thinking about 100 or 500 or 1,000 cows and you're paying a collar fee every year, that adds up really quick. And so one of the co-authors on this paper came up with this online tool. The website's on the bottom right of that slide there. And so this is basically comparing the three that Caden talked about, Vence, Halter, and Gallagher eShepherd, as well as No Fence. So No Fence, I've got some colleagues down in New Mexico State and some colleagues at Texas using No Fence, which is kind of the fourth of the biggest ones, rounding out the different brands. And so these are all different sliders. So these numbers up here are just a screenshot of what I took. But again, you might talk to Vence and figure out you actually need 4 base stations for Vence. You only need 3 if you go with Halter or whatever it may be. And so this is where you do a lot of that homework up front, kind of sound like Darla did on her own. Hopefully this makes it a little bit easier, but talk to the rep. Give them the topo map of your ranch. What do you want to use it for? What are your objectives? And then you can kind of move these sliders around and they'll do a pretty good job of comparing, should I actually put in some barbed wire or should I go with one of these different companies? So real quick, just to close it out, I know we're getting close on time. When I think about virtual fence, right? Some people say it works, some people say it doesn't. Well, I say, what did you try to use it for, right? You really need to define your objective. So is it animal performance or is it rangeland management or both? Because you might have some really good outcomes in terms of animal gains or cows, that get pregnant, but you're beating up your range. So what is the reason you're implementing this change in grazing management, right? And that helps define whether this is a good investment or not, and whether or not you achieve success and over what time frame, right? Because some range management improvements might take a decade before we see any sort of meaningful results. Animal health and welfare are important, right? So I think we talked about this earlier. A cow isn't keeping up with the rest of the herd. What's going on? Well, I've had ranchers go out there and say they found a sick calf and it's still alive and they doctored it and saved it. So how many sick calves does it take to pay to cover the cost of that tower? One I think that's really going to be important here in Colorado specifically is carnivore interaction. So, right, with wolves, I do a lot of work with the wolf reintroduction as well, and so you need to have a confirmed depredation event to trigger any of those payments. So if an animal stops moving and you can get Parks and Wildlife out there to say yes, this was a wolf kill, that's in your benefit. So the sooner you can do that before it gets scavenged by other animals is to your benefit. And then for some of those indirect costs, like lower weaning weights, lower conception rates, those sorts of things, if you can then show that, yeah, my cows were there, I have a confirmed depredation, and I can now see that my animals are moving farther and faster than they had before, you've got a better case, I think, to make some claims on some of those indirect costs. And again, think about whether you want to exclude or include, because those are different reasons to have virtual fence, right? So an inclusion area might be, I want to just camp all of my cattle down on this area that on, this pasture over in this drainage, I know got rain and has really good high quality forage. I want them all there until it's gone. Or I want to target grazed cheatgrass or those fire breaks versus exclusion, right? So we talked about this. Maybe I got a pasture that's got, 20% of it's really thick with larkspur. And in the past, I just have to not turn out, right? Well, now if I can actually use it and my cows trust that fence, right? They respect it. I can still graze the other 75, 80% of that pasture. As well as sensitive areas, again, on public lands, that's an issue. Here's one thing I think it's a learning curve, right? I think Darla spoke to this well. You learn, right? Caden said that we got a new update. It's a learning curve, but same thing with phones, right? Our phones are in our pocket now, right? We have computers in our pocket. When I was a kid, I remember my dad brought home the first computer I ever saw. Like, what the heck is this thing, right? And now we all have them in our pockets. And so you will get better at it. The technology will get better too. No one talks about this, but the current collars out there that Vence uses, they're still technically the beta collars. They're testing their final collars this summer at research stations. So the new collars will come out likely in 2026 and into 2027. So you're going to have whole new systems on that, right? So they had more growth than they thought, and so again, even the hardware is going to continue to improve. And you will learn about your animals. You're going to see the cows that travel farther from water to get to that grass on their own, right? And so it can help you with your kind of retention and culling decisions as well, I think. And then the last one, we talked about this a little bit as well too, public versus private lands. Are there different priorities? If I change my management on my home ground, how does that play out with my grazing management on public ground? If there's a big fire that comes through on a Forest Service allotment and they don't have money to put in fencing up in the high country, and I now have to use vents or lose access to that lease, then does it make sense to pony up the extra money to put a base station on my home operation as well? So a lot of things to think about. There's not a yes or no for everyone. There are a lot of potential benefits and a lot of potential costs, but I do think that this technology is a little bit of a wave of the future, and it's coming. And if you don't want to get into the whole virtual fence, Caden talked about it a little bit. There are a couple other GPS ear tags we've used. So 701X does a pretty good job, as well as Sarah's tags, and they actually can tell you not just GPS, but how many hours a day animals spend grazing versus walking versus resting. So I think there's a lot. You're about to be inundated with a lot of information and data that maybe we haven't had at our disposal in the past. And so finding ways to use that, to Darla's point, to keep from subdividing our place to put into houses, I think is going to be something that we're going to have to use into the future. So with that, I'll leave my email address up there for just a second in case you guys have any questions. Feel free to reach out. But I'm probably over my time, and I know it's late in the day and people want to go do some fun things. So
Thanks,
I'll turn it
John.
back over to Caden.
Yeah, no, that was really good. A lot of good information. I do think I just want to touch on what you talked about a little bit. It's with this technology, and I think all the available technologies at the moment. I kind of rounded off all of my presentation last year with this one thing that it's situational specific with everything. So with this technology specifically, at the moment, I think you have to really analyze your operation, what your goals are for that operation, like John said, and you know, it's not a end all solving every solution for every rancher if you implement this technology. And we both touched on different technologies, and I think you need to figure out which one works best for you for your specific goals. I'll stick around here for a little bit for any questions. I think Hannah will as well. And if Darla and John, if you wanted to stick around for just a few minutes, just in case somebody had some questions, ask away if need be.
Hi, this is Kathy. I just had a question for Darla, and maybe Caden can answer this too with what you've looked at on some of these ranches. But have you noticed an increase in your stocking density using the virtual fencing? Have you been able to utilize your pastures a little bit better so that you can use your AMUs more efficiently, AUMs more efficiently?
I can answer that one, on just a little bit of, we never could rotational graze our fields very well because we have so many deer and elk. So it was just a constant, they just tore it down every night. So yes, I've been able to use these to rotational graze and up the stocking rates.
In my experience, with the ranchers I've talked to, there's never been really, that hasn't been a significant cost benefit analysis, part of my cost benefit analysis, because I don't think a whole lot of ranchers have been using it long enough to be able to confidently improve their stocking rates. But Darla's been using it for 5 years, and she's one of the longest ranchers. So I do think she's probably go off of her statement for sure. Because my experience, most of them, they're 2 or 3 years in, if that. So.
Thank you.
Well, if there's no more questions, I think we'll sign off. I want to thank everybody for coming tonight. John and Darla, you guys did amazing. I'm so glad I was able to have you guys as support for this, because there's a lot of good information you guys added. So thank you guys. I don't have my email up here, but it's just my full name at colostate.edu if you guys want to write that down, and if you need to contact me. And then also the local CSU extensions office, I'll be working with them for some more weeks if you wanted to contact them. And then Hannah Craner Kirsting is there as well for the virtual fencing trials here in Gunnison. So thank you everybody for coming, and I think we'll all sign off now.
Thank you, Tyler.